The world of daytime television is often dismissed as a guilty pleasure, a form of escapism that fills the hours between morning talk shows and evening primetime dramas. Yet, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, one man transformed that world forever. His name was Anthony Giri. And with his piercing blue eyes, rugged charisma, and complex performance, he turned General Hospital into a cultural phenomenon. But behind that unforgettable face, and the character that America could not stop watching, lay a man burdened with contradictions, disappointments, and a haunting loneliness that fame never managed to erase. At 78 years old, the story of Anthony Giri is no longer one of Hollywood celebration. It is one of heartbreak. Born on May 29, 1947, in Colville, Utah, Geary grew up in an ordinary household far from the glamour of Hollywood. His father ran a construction company. His mother devoted her life to raising the family. Anthony was never destined for stardom, or so it seemed. But from a young age, he carried a restless spirit, one that longed for the stage. That longing led him to the University of Utah, where he studied theater and quickly became the standout among his peers. He was tall, magnetic, and possessed a dramatic presence that made even the simplest lines feel like thunder rolling across the stage. Hollywood, however, is rarely welcoming to outsiders. For years, Geary scraped by with minor roles on television shows such as All in the Family and Barnaby Jones. These were thankless parts, background characters who disappeared after one or two episodes. Yet even in these fleeting moments, casting directors noted something rare, an intensity, a subtle darkness that few actors could deliver in front of a camera. It was this very quality that would one day catapult him into the center of America's living rooms. In 1978, General Hospital, then a struggling soap opera, was in desperate need of revival. Ratings were plummeting, and ABC executives were ready to cancel the show. The producers decided to gamble on a controversial storyline that would introduce a new anti-hero, a streetwise man named Luke Spencer. Unlike the polished doctors and nurses who dominated the fictional Port Charles, Luke was rough, morally ambiguous, and unpredictable. To the surprise of many, Anthony Giri won the role. What he didn't know at the time was that this single decision would alter the course of his entire life and eventually chain him to a role that he would both love and resent. Luke Spencer was unlike anything daytime television had seen before. He was charming, yet dangerous, vulnerable, yet manipulative. He carried both menace and tenderness in equal measure, and Geary leaned into every contradiction. Audiences were immediately captivated. By 1981, the storyline of Luke and Laura's wedding had become the most watched episode in soap opera history, with over 30 million viewers tuning in. Even the legendary Elizabeth Taylor made a cameo, solidifying the moment as a national event. Anthony Giri was no longer just an actor, he was a phenomenon. But fame has a way of rewriting a person's destiny. Almost overnight, Geary's identity fused with Luke Spencer. Strangers shouted, "Luke!" when he walked down the street. Tabloids obsessed over him. Fans sent thousands of letters weekly, begging for his attention. To the world, Anthony Giri had achieved the dream. Yet, to Geary himself, the dream was quickly turning into a nightmare. He had studied Shakespeare and Chekhov. He had wanted to tread the boards of Broadway, to lose himself in characters both profound and strange. Instead, he was chained to a soap opera character, one who, despite his complexity, was ultimately confined by the repetitiveness of daytime television. The weight of that paradox grew heavier with each passing year. He was celebrated, awarded, and financially secure, but inside he felt trapped, pigeonholed, invisible as an artist. Even as he accepted daytime Emmy awards, eventually setting a record with 8 wins, He would later confess that the recognition felt hollow. "Luke Spencer was both the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to me," he once admitted. Those words would echo across decades of his career, revealing a truth that few fans wanted to confront. The man behind the legend was slowly unraveling. As the 1980s faded into the 1990s, Anthony Giri attempted escape. He left General Hospital, hoping to find roles in film and primetime television. Yet Hollywood had already typecast him. Casting directors saw Luke Spencer, not Anthony Giri. They refused to take the risk of seeing him as anything else. Disillusioned, Geary returned to the very show he had once tried to outrun. It was a bitter surrender. He would continue to play Luke Spencer on and off for decades, building a legacy that was undeniable, but at the cost of his artistic freedom. While America celebrated him, Anthony Giry's personal life told a different story. Unlike many stars of his era, he never married. He never had children. He rarely spoke about his private world, choosing instead to retreat into solitude. In interviews, he often appeared guarded, his words laced with a quiet melancholy. Behind the Emmy trophies and the smiling red carpet photos was a man who, despite his fame, lived alone. Friends described him as brilliant, witty, and generous, but also deeply private and sometimes distant. He preferred quiet evenings at home, with books and music over Hollywood parties. As he aged, his sense of alienation from the industry grew stronger. Eventually, after decades of carrying Luke Spencer on his shoulders, he retired in 2015. But instead of basking in the admiration of fans, Geary boarded a plane to Amsterdam, where he has lived ever since. It was there, far from the cameras and the relentless pressure of Hollywood, that Anthony Giri sought the peace he could never find in America. And yet, even in retirement, the tragedy remains. At 78 years old, Anthony Giri is a man remembered for one role, despite his lifelong yearning to be more. His story is not just about an actor who conquered television. It is about an artist trapped by his own success, a man who gave the world everything on screen but found himself with so little off it. The heartbreak of Anthony Giri is that, even in victory, he was defeated. By the early 1980s, General Hospital was no longer just another soap opera. It was the epicenter of pop culture. And, at its heart, were two characters whose names would forever be linked in television history: Luke and Laura. Their love story transcended the boundaries of daytime drama, becoming an obsession for millions of viewers. It was Anthony Giri's most celebrated triumph, and yet it would also become his lifelong burden. The storyline began with darkness. Luke Spencer was first introduced as a morally ambiguous character, even an antagonist. In one of the most controversial arcs in soap history, his relationship with Laura Webber, played by Jeannie Francis, started under circumstances that would later be described as both shocking and problematic. Yet, as the story unfolded, audiences saw Luke evolve, his rough edges softening, his vulnerabilities surfacing. What began as controversy morphed into one of television's most iconic romances. By November 17, 1981, when Luke and Laura exchanged vows in a lavishly televised wedding, the nation was transfixed. Over 30 million viewers tuned in, a number unheard of for daytime television. Schools closed early. Offices allowed employees to watch. The episode became a cultural phenomenon, with headlines calling it the wedding of the century. Even Elizabeth Taylor, a fan of the show, appeared in a cameo role, cementing the moment in Hollywood lore. For Anthony Giri, it was the pinnacle of recognition. Suddenly, he was not just a soap opera actor, he was a household name. Magazine covers, talk shows, and award ceremonies clamored for his presence. Luke Spencer was no longer simply a character. He was an archetype, the ultimate flawed hero who captured the hearts of a nation. But beneath the applause and the roaring ratings, Geary's heart was restless. Privately, he struggled with the contradictions of Luke's story. He once admitted in interviews that he found the origins of the Luke and Laura relationship troubling. While the audience saw romance, Geary recognized the darker undertones and questioned the morality of glorifying such a pairing. This inner conflict gnawed at him. On screen, he played the hero America adored. Off-screen, he carried the weight of knowing the story's shadows. That tension, while invisible to viewers, became part of his personal torment. Meanwhile, his professional identity grew increasingly entwined with Luke Spencer. Casting directors refused to see him as anyone else. Offers for different roles were scarce, and when they did arrive, they were often shallow imitations of the Luke archetype, rugged anti-heroes with little depth. Geary turned them down, hoping for something more meaningful, but Hollywood's memory was short. He was trapped inside the very success he had worked so hard to achieve. This artistic imprisonment was compounded by the relentless pace of soap opera production. Unlike films or primetime series, daytime dramas churn out 5 episodes a week, year after year. The workload was brutal. Lines had to be memorized overnight. Scenes were often filmed in one take, regardless of complexity. There was little time for reflection or growth, only the endless grind of production. For an actor like Geary, who had dreamed of Shakespearean grandeur, it was soul-crushing. And yet, despite his frustration, Geary delivered performances that elevated the material. He infused Luke with a depth and complexity that few soap characters ever achieved. His eyes could flicker from mischief to despair in a single line. His voice could crack with vulnerability before hardening with resolve. Viewers didn't just watch Luke, they felt him. This ability to humanize a character so deeply flawed was Geary's gift, and it was what kept audiences loyal to General Hospital for decades. But fame is a double-edged sword. With every fan letter, every screaming crowd outside the studio gates, Geary felt his own identity slipping away. He once said that being called Luke everywhere he went was like living inside a cage. The world adored Luke Spencer, but who cared for Anthony Giri? As the years went on, the line between the two blurred, until even Geary himself sometimes struggled to separate the man from the myth. The cost of this conflation was steep. While many of his peers in Hollywood built lives filled with family, relationships, and varied roles, Geary's personal world remained quiet, almost eerily so. He never married. He never had children. His companions were often books, music, and the solace of solitude. In a city that thrived on parties, premieres, and paparazzi, Geary was a ghost, slipping away from the spotlight whenever possible. Colleagues often spoke of his brilliance on set, but also of his distance. Jeannie Francis, who shared so many iconic scenes with him, described their bond as professional but tinged with complexity. The chemistry they shared on screen was undeniable, but off-screen, Geary was guarded, protective of his inner world. That emotional wall was both his shield and his prison. By the 1990s, the cracks in his life became harder to hide. Geary attempted to leave General Hospital, desperate to reinvent himself. He sought roles in film and primetime TV, hoping to shed the Luke Spencer skin once and for all. But Hollywood was unforgiving. Casting agents, executives, even audiences could not dissociate him from the soap opera hero. He was typecast in the cruelest sense, admired but limited. Eventually, with few options, he returned to General Hospital. It was a reluctant homecoming, a tacit admission that escape was impossible. This return only deepened his sense of entrapment. The cycle repeated: acclaim, awards, fan adoration, followed by disillusionment, regret, and the aching realization that he would never break free. Each daytime Emmy he received, 8 in total, was a testament to his talent, but also a reminder of the cage he could not unlock. And through it all, Anthony Giri grew older, more weary, more resigned. The once fiery actor who dreamed of conquering stages and screens beyond Port Charles was now tethered to a single identity, his creative spirit bruised by the very role that had made him famous. To the public, he was Luke, forever. To himself, he was a man drowning in the shadow of his own creation. As the years turned into decades, the tragedy of Anthony Giri became clearer. He had achieved the impossible, yet he had lost himself in the process. His story was no longer just about success or failure. It was about the suffocating price of fame, the cruel irony of being remembered for the very thing that eroded your soul. For most actors, winning one Emmy is a dream. For Anthony Giri, the awards became almost routine. Over the course of his career, he would go on to collect 8 Daytime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series, setting a record that cemented his name in television history. Each time he stood on stage, gold statue in hand, the applause thundered around him. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing a man who seemed humbled, grateful, and proud. Yet inside, Geary felt a hollowness that no award could fill. To the outside world, he was the king of daytime television. Colleagues praised him. Critics admired him. Fans adored him. But the irony was cruel. The more recognition he received for Luke Spencer, the more invisible Anthony Giri felt. With every Emmy win, he was reminded of the artistic life he had wanted, the Broadway stages, the Shakespearean tragedies, the chance to play men of depth and consequence beyond the soap opera soundstage. Instead, he was rewarded again and again for being Luke, the very identity he longed to escape. The nature of daytime television only deepened the burden. Scripts were churned out at breakneck speed. 5 episodes a week meant relentless memorization, endless takes, and no time to explore the subtleties of performance. While primetime actors had months to prepare for a role, Geary was asked to digest entire story arcs overnight. He brought brilliance to the material, but the grind was punishing. Slowly, exhaustion took its toll physically, mentally, and emotionally. Colleagues noticed. Crew members described Geary as fiercely professional, always prepared, always delivering, but they also noticed the weight he carried, the way his eyes sometimes betrayed fatigue that no makeup could cover. Off-set, he withdrew into solitude. There were no glamorous parties, no red carpet romances. Unlike many of his peers, he never sought the spotlight outside the studio. Instead, he retreated into the quiet, a man who had given everything to his craft, yet found little nourishment in return. Speculation about his personal life followed him throughout his career. Why had he never married? Why were there no children, no partners by his side? In an industry where relationships often became tabloid fodder, Geary's silence was deafening. He guarded his privacy fiercely, refusing to allow the public into the corners of his heart. But that secrecy also fueled the image of a man alone, isolated in the very world that had once worshipped him. There were whispers of health struggles, too. The grueling demands of soap opera acting, combined with the natural toll of aging, left Geary battling persistent back problems and physical pain. The strain of decades on set had left him weary, and the fatigue only compounded his sense of alienation. While fans continued to see Luke Spencer as strong, charming, and unstoppable, the man behind the character often fought to simply keep going. By the 2000s, Anthony Giri was a paradox. On one hand, he was a television legend, celebrated with standing ovations and the undying loyalty of millions of fans. On the other, he was a man worn down by the cage of his own success. His face, once filled with the fire of ambition, now reflected the exhaustion of carrying Luke Spencer for so long. Even when he took breaks from General Hospital, the weight followed him. There was no escaping Luke. The shadow loomed too large. Yet Geary was no victim. He channeled his frustrations into performance, delivering some of his finest work during this period. He leaned into Luke's complexity, exploring the character's moral ambiguities, his internal struggles, his darkness and light. Fans often remarked that Geary elevated soap opera acting into something transcendent. His ability to convey layers of emotion with just a glance or a pause was unparalleled. He brought Shakespearean depth to daytime television, even when he felt trapped by it. But as the years passed, Geary began to think about life beyond Hollywood. He had spent decades being Luke Spencer. But what remained of Anthony Giri? Retirement loomed, not as a choice, but as a necessity. He could no longer endure the grind, the pressure, the suffocating identity that the world had forced upon him. In 2015, Geary made the decision that fans had long dreaded. He announced his retirement from General Hospital. The farewell was emotional, both for the audience and for Geary himself. In interviews, he spoke with a mixture of relief and sadness. He was grateful for the role, grateful for the fans, but he could no longer deny the truth. The time had come to close the curtain. Yet his next move shocked many. Instead of staying in Los Angeles, basking in the legacy he had built, Geary boarded a plane to Amsterdam. It was not a vacation. It was an escape. Far from Hollywood, far from the endless reminders of Luke Spencer, Geary sought peace in the canals and quiet streets of the Netherlands. There, surrounded by art, history, and anonymity, he found a sense of freedom that had eluded him for most of his life. Amsterdam offered him something Los Angeles never could: obscurity. No fans chased him, no tabloids speculated about him, no producers demanded more of him. For the first time in decades, he was not Luke Spencer. He was simply Anthony. He could walk along the canals, browse bookstores, sit in a cafe with a cup of coffee, and be left alone. It was in that solitude that he began to reclaim fragments of the life he had lost. And yet, even in Amsterdam, the tragedy lingered. At 78 years old, Anthony Giri lives with the paradox of his existence. He is a man who gave everything to a role that made him immortal in the world of television, but at the cost of his own personal fulfillment. He is celebrated, remembered, admired, but also alone, far from the Hollywood that once consumed him. The image is bittersweet, an actor who achieved the dream of fame only to find that the dream was hollow. Anthony Giri's story is not just about the rise and fall of a star. It is about the dangerous seduction of fame itself, the way it lifts, the way it destroys, and the way it leaves behind a silence that is almost unbearable. The decision to leave Hollywood was not simply retirement. It was an act of survival. When Anthony Giri walked away from General Hospital in 2015, he was closing the final chapter on nearly 4 decades of playing Luke Spencer. Yet, instead of settling into a comfortable life of celebrity appearances, memoir deals, or nostalgic fan conventions, Geary chose exile. His destination was Amsterdam, a city of canals, bicycles, and anonymity. To some, this move seemed strange. Why would a man with fame, fortune, and a beloved fan base choose to vanish into obscurity? The answer lay in Geary's lifelong longing for freedom. In Los Angeles, he could never escape Luke Spencer. In Amsterdam, he could finally become invisible. There, he wasn't a soap opera legend. He was just another man riding a bike through the narrow cobblestone streets, another face in the crowd at a cafe, another soul wandering the galleries of the Rijksmuseum. Amsterdam offered Geary what Hollywood had denied him: space to breathe. He bought a house along one of the city's quieter canals, filling it with books, art, and music. He spent his days walking, cycling, or reading. Friends who visited spoke of a man who had at last found a measure of peace. "He can live like a normal person here," one friend said. "Nobody calls him Luke. Nobody asks for autographs. He is Anthony." And yet, the quiet was not without its shadows. For decades, Geary's life had been defined by the relentless rhythm of production. The lines to memorize, the scenes to shoot, the fans to please. Now, the silence was deafening. The applause was gone. The cameras were gone. For a man who had given his life to performance, the sudden stillness was both liberating and haunting. Geary himself has admitted that the transition was difficult. Retirement, after all, is not just the end of work. It is the end of identity. Who was he, if not Luke Spencer? The paradox returned, sharper than ever. He had spent years wanting to escape the character, and now that he finally had, he wasn't sure what remained of himself. Loneliness lingered. At 78, Geary remains unmarried, with no children, no partner by his side. He has spoken of being content in solitude, but friends and colleagues whisper of a deeper sadness, a sense of isolation that has always haunted him. Unlike many stars, there are no public family photos, no grandchildren to share stories with, no spouse to lean on in the twilight years. Just Anthony, alone in his Amsterdam home, carrying the memories of a life defined by both triumph and emptiness. The physical toll of his career also followed him overseas. Years of grueling production schedules left him with chronic back problems and other health struggles. Though he found some relief in the slower pace of life in Amsterdam, the reality of aging was unavoidable. Fans occasionally spot him in rare interviews, noting how frail he appears, how different he looks from the rugged Luke Spencer they remember. Time, relentless and unkind, has etched its mark on the man once idolized by millions. And yet, there is a certain poetry in Geary's Exile. He spends his days surrounded by art, culture, and history, the very things that once inspired him to pursue acting. He visits galleries, attends concerts, reads voraciously. In the absence of performance, he has returned to being a student of the arts, the wide-eyed young man from Utah who once dreamed of Shakespearean stages. For all his heartbreak, there is still beauty in his retreat. But the question remains, is he truly at peace? Or has Amsterdam merely become another stage, a quieter one, where he plays the role of a man content with solitude while carrying wounds that never healed? Those who know him best suggest the truth lies somewhere in between. He has escaped the suffocating weight of Luke Spencer, but he has not escaped the loneliness of Anthony Giri. The tragedy of his story is not only what fame took from him, but also what it gave. It gave him recognition, wealth, and a legacy that millions will remember. But it also robbed him of privacy, of artistic freedom, of a personal life filled with love and companionship. It left him with a career of brilliance and a life of silence. As the world moves on, younger generations may not even know his name. Soap operas, once a cornerstone of American television, have faded in cultural significance. The phenomenon of Luke and Laura is now a piece of nostalgia, a story told in documentaries and YouTube clips rather than in the collective consciousness of a nation. Geary himself seems aware of this fading legacy. In interviews, he rarely speaks of General Hospital with bitterness, but there is a weariness in his tone, as if he has long accepted that history will remember him for one thing and one thing only. And so, at 78, Anthony Giri sits in his Amsterdam home, a man both liberated and haunted. He is free from Luke, but he is still bound to him. He is at peace in obscurity, but he is also a ghost of his former self. His story is not one of downfall or scandal, but of something more insidious, the slow erosion of identity under the crushing weight of fame. The canals of Amsterdam may offer tranquility, but they cannot erase the questions that follow him. Did he sacrifice too much for a role he never truly loved? Did fame steal from him the chance at a fuller, richer life? And perhaps most haunting of all, when the curtain finally falls on Anthony Giri's life, will the world remember the man, or only the character who consumed him? The word legacy is one that actors cling to. For some, it is a resume of diverse roles, a string of iconic performances across genres and decades. For others, it is the preservation of their image as larger-than-life figures in the collective imagination. For Anthony Giri, legacy is both a crown and a curse. At 78 years old, he is celebrated as the greatest soap opera actor of his generation. Yet he is remembered almost exclusively for one role. The paradox is cruel. The very thing that brought him immortality also erased much of who he wanted to be. When people think of Anthony Giri, they think of Luke Spencer. They think of that rakish smile, the mane of blonde hair, the brooding anti-hero who stole America's heart in the 1980s. They think of Luke and Laura's wedding, that singular pop culture moment that drew more viewers than many Super Bowls. They think of the Emmys, the magazine covers, the decades of storylines that made General Hospital not just a soap, but an institution. For millions, Luke Spencer is unforgettable. Anthony Giri, however, often feels like a footnote behind his own creation. This is not the legacy Geary dreamed of as a young theater student in Utah. He had imagined Shakespeare's Hamlet, Chekhov's Ivanov, complex roles in films that would test the limits of his craft. Instead, he found himself immortalized as a character he both loved and loathed. To fans, Luke Spencer was a triumph. To Geary, Luke was a prison, an elaborate cage lined with gold. Yet, the truth is more complicated. While Geary has often spoken of his frustration at being typecast, he also knew that without Luke, his career might never have reached such extraordinary heights. Few actors, even in Hollywood, can claim to have created a character that defined an era. Few can say they became the face of a cultural phenomenon. Luke Spencer was bigger than daytime television. He was a symbol of the flawed hero America wanted in the late 20th century. And Geary gave him life with such depth that even critics, who dismissed soap operas as frivolous, had to acknowledge his brilliance. Still, legacy is not only about what the world remembers. It is about what remains in the heart of the person who lived it. For Geary, that inner legacy is tinged with sorrow. He never escaped the shadow of Luke. Even in Amsterdam, strangers occasionally recognize him, their eyes lighting up with the thrill of seeing Luke Spencer in the flesh. For a moment, the past comes rushing back. And yet, for Geary, these encounters are bittersweet reminders of the identity that consumed his life. His solitude only deepens the poignancy of his legacy. In Hollywood, legends are often surrounded by families, protégés, or circles of admirers who keep their stories alive. Geary, by contrast, has chosen a life of distance. There is no spouse to speak of his private joys, no children to carry his memory, no memoir to tell his side of the story. His silence has created an enigma, but it has also left him vulnerable to being defined solely by what the world saw on screen. The tragedy of Anthony Giri is not scandal or downfall. It is invisibility. He is visible everywhere in reruns, documentaries, and fan nostalgia, but the man himself has become invisible, even to history. When fans speak of him, they often speak of Luke. When the entertainment industry honors him, it is for General Hospital. The breadth of his humanity, the struggles, the dreams, the loneliness remains largely hidden, locked away in the quiet rooms of his Amsterdam home. And yet, perhaps, that is how Geary wants it. In interviews, he has hinted that legacy is not something he chases. He has spoken of peace, of enjoying anonymity, of walking through life as an ordinary man. Maybe the greatest act of defiance for a man so bound by fame is to vanish into the ordinary. Maybe his legacy, in his own eyes, is not the character the world adored, but the freedom he carved for himself in his final years. Still, the silence is haunting. At 78, Geary is approaching the twilight of his life. The industry that once celebrated him has largely moved on. Soap operas themselves are fading, their dominance replaced by streaming services and prestige dramas. The cultural landscape that made Luke and Laura's wedding an event for millions no longer exists. For younger generations, Geary is a name without resonance, Only in the memories of those who lived through the phenomenon does his legend remain vivid. This fading relevance is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of his story. To give so much of oneself to art, to achieve a level of success few ever know, only to watch it all dissolve into nostalgia that is a tragedy few can endure gracefully. Geary does so with stoic acceptance, but the sadness lingers in the lines of his face, in the way he chooses words carefully in interviews, as though measuring what the world deserves to know and what he must keep for himself. The legacy of Anthony Giri is a lesson in the dangerous seduction of fame. It is proof that success can sometimes steal more than failure ever could. It can steal time, identity, freedom, and the chance for a life beyond the stage. Geary has given the world a character that will outlive him, but the cost has been profound. A life of solitude, of unfulfilled artistic dreams, of being remembered for only a fragment of his talent. And yet, there is dignity in his story too. He did not implode under scandal, addiction, or public disgrace. He did not burn out in a blaze of destruction. He walked away, quietly, deliberately, into a life of his own choosing. In that sense, Anthony Giri remains a figure of resilience, a man who endured the suffocating embrace of fame and still found a way to breathe. As he looks out over the canals of Amsterdam, perhaps he finds comfort in the stillness, in the anonymity he fought so hard to reclaim. Perhaps he accepts that his legacy will always belong more to Luke Spencer than to Anthony Giri, and perhaps, in his quiet exile, he has made peace with that truth. But for the rest of us, his story remains heartbreaking. Because when we remember Anthony Giri, we remember not just the brilliance of his performance, but the silent cost behind it. We remember the tragedy of a man who gave everything to the world and was left, in the end, with only himself. There is a moment every performer dreads, the final curtain call, when the lights dim, the audience rises, and the thunderous applause eventually fades into silence. For Anthony Giri, that silence has lasted nearly a decade. Since his retirement in 2015, he has lived in relative obscurity in Amsterdam, oceans away from the studios, the cameras, and the millions of fans who once hung on his every word. But silence, though peaceful, can also be unbearable. For a man who spent nearly his entire adult life under the harsh lights of performance, the quiet has been both a blessing and a curse. In the early years of his retirement, fans clamored for his return. Social media buzzed with speculation. Would Luke Spencer come back for a surprise arc? Would Geary make a cameo to honor General Hospital anniversaries? Each year, as the soap celebrated milestones, questions about Anthony Giri resurfaced, but his answer remained the same. No. He had closed that chapter permanently. For him, Luke Spencer was not a role to revisit, but a ghost to leave behind. And yet, Luke never left him. Reruns of General Hospital continue to air. Clips of Luke and Laura's wedding circulate online, watched by younger audiences discovering them for the first time. Documentaries about television history feature his face, his voice, his performances. Even when he hides in Amsterdam, Anthony Giri cannot fully escape Luke Spencer. Fame is not something that ends, it lingers, like an echo in a canyon, repeating itself long after the voice has gone silent. For fans, Giri remains a beloved figure, but their love is tinged with nostalgia. They remember the days when Luke and Laura were cultural icons, when their wedding drew more viewers than most primetime shows, when Anthony Giri's face was splashed across magazines and television screens. To them, Geary is frozen in time, forever young, forever Luke. But the reality is far different. At 78, Geary is an older man now, his once golden hair silvered, his body slowed by age and years of physical strain. For many fans, this transformation is shocking. For Geary, it is simply life. life that he lives far from the gaze of those who once adored him. And here lies the heartbreaking paradox. While millions remember him fondly, he spends his days largely alone. His home in Amsterdam is not filled with the chatter of children or the warmth of a family gathered for dinner. It is filled with books, music, and silence. Visitors describe a man who is content in his routines, but also marked by solitude. He reads, he writes, he explores the city on foot or by bicycle. There is tranquility, but also an undeniable emptiness. Some close friends have described Geary as a man who has made peace with his solitude. They insist he is not bitter, that he values privacy over the chaos of fame. Yet even those friends admit that solitude is a double-edged sword. It protects, but it also isolates. And as the years pass, the isolation grows heavier. In interviews, Geary has hinted at this reality. He has spoken of contentment, but with an undercurrent of melancholy, as if even he is not entirely convinced. The contrast between his solitude and his fans' devotion is striking. Online, countless forums and fan pages are dedicated to him. They share old clips, celebrate his Emmy wins, and post tributes on his birthday. Fans send letters to ABC Studios, hoping they will be forwarded to him. They reminisce about how Luke Spencer helped them through difficult times, how Anthony Giri's performances touched their lives. In their eyes, he is not just an actor. He is a part of their personal history. Yet, the man himself lives far removed from that devotion, tucked away in Amsterdam, watching life unfold quietly, perhaps never fully realizing the depth of the impact he had on others. This disconnect is what makes Geary's story so profoundly tragic. He achieved what few actors ever do: cultural immortality. And yet, he lives as though he were forgotten. It is not scandal that shadows him, nor disgrace, but the silent ache of being remembered for something he no longer wants to carry. He has millions of admirers, but few companions. He has a legacy, but little personal fulfillment. The applause may echo eternally in reruns and fan tributes, but in his home, there is only silence. As he ages, the specter of mortality grows nearer. At 78, Geary faces the reality that his story is closer to its end than its beginning. He has no heirs to carry his name, no family to gather around his memory. When he dies, his legacy will live on in the form of Luke Spencer, in clips of General Hospital, in the hearts of fans who still recall the phenomenon of the 1980s. But Anthony Giri, the man, the private soul behind the performance, risks fading away almost entirely. And yet, perhaps that is his final act. Perhaps, in retreating to Amsterdam, he has crafted his own ending. A man who gave himself to the world for decades, and then took himself back in the final years. Perhaps his silence is not a tragedy, but a statement that the applause is fleeting, that fame is a mirage, and that peace is found not in being remembered, but in being free. Still, for those who admired him, the image remains haunting. To think of Anthony Giri, alone in his Amsterdam home, a legend in exile, is to confront the harshest truth of fame, that it gives without mercy and takes without warning. It gave him a legacy that cannot be erased, but it also took the chance for a life filled with family, love, and the comfort of companionship. And as he walks the quiet streets of Amsterdam, far from the cameras and the cheers, he carries the weight of both. The silence after the applause is where Anthony Giri now lives. And in that silence, his tragedy becomes clear, not because he was forgotten, but because he was remembered only as Luke Spencer, while Anthony Giri, the man, the dreamer, the artist, remained hidden in the shadows. Every life has two stories, the one the world sees and the one that remains hidden. For Anthony Giri, the world saw Luke Spencer. They saw the anti-hero who became a romantic icon, the flawed man who won 8 daytime Emmys, the actor who carried General Hospital into television history. But what of the hidden story? What of Anthony Giri, the man behind the mask, the man whose life has always seemed shrouded in shadows and unanswered questions? At 78, Geary lives far from the cameras, but his absence has only made his mystery more compelling. Fans scour interviews for clues. Was he truly content in his solitude, or was he masking a deeper loneliness? Why did he never marry? Why no memoir, no documentary, no final act to share his truth? The silence itself has become part of his legend. In an age where celebrities bear every detail of their lives online, Geary's refusal to reveal himself is both frustrating and fascinating. Perhaps this was always his nature. From the beginning, Geary guarded his inner world. He gave everything to his performances, but little to the tabloids. He resisted being consumed by Hollywood's machinery, even as it consumed his identity. He remained private, enigmatic, distant. In that sense, his retreat to Amsterdam was not an escape, but the natural conclusion of a life spent balancing the public's hunger with his own need for privacy. Still, the tragedy remains. Fame never allowed him to be fully Anthony. To his fans, he will always be Luke. To his industry, he was the face of daytime drama. But who was he to himself? That question hangs in the air, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Maybe even Geary does not fully know. Decades of being Luke Spencer blurred the lines between character and actor until the man himself became elusive. And yet, there is something profoundly human in that struggle. Anthony Giry's story is not one of scandal or destruction, but of yearning for freedom, for recognition, for identity. It is the story of an artist trapped in a role too large to escape, of a man who achieved immortality but longed for anonymity. His tragedy is quieter than most Hollywood tales, but in its quietness, it is even more devastating. As he faces the twilight of his life, Geary carries with him the contradictions of his existence. He is a legend, but also forgotten. He is celebrated, but also alone. He is immortalized on screen, but invisible in life. His house in Amsterdam, filled with books and silence, is both sanctuary and prison. The canals reflect not just the city's beauty, but also the isolation of a man who once stood before millions and now walks alone. Yet, perhaps that is where the dignity lies. Geary never chased fame for its own sake. He never sold his soul for scandal, never courted controversy to remain relevant. He left on his own terms, vanishing into a life that only he could define. That act of defiance may be his true legacy, the refusal to let Hollywood dictate his ending. But for those who loved him, the heartbreak persists. They remember the fire in his eyes, the depth of his performances, the way he made them believe in love, in pain, in redemption. They remember how Luke Spencer was not just a character, but a part of their own lives. For them, Anthony Giri is not forgotten. He lives on in memory, in reruns, in the echoes of a time when television could bring the world to a standstill. And so, the tragedy of Anthony Giri is not just his own, it is ours. It is the tragedy of a culture that demands so much of its artists, yet offers so little in return. It is the tragedy of a man who gave his soul to performance and found himself emptied by it. It is the tragedy of knowing that when his time comes, the world will mourn Luke Spencer, but may never truly know Anthony Giri. As the curtain falls on his life, one question remains. Will anyone ever tell the full story of the man beyond Luke? Or will he remain forever hidden, his truth locked away in the silence of Amsterdam, known only to himself? For now, the answer is uncertain. What is certain is this: Anthony Giri's life, with all its triumphs and heartbreaks, is a reminder of the fragile line between fame and freedom, between legacy and loss. At 78, he is living proof that success can be both a blessing and a curse, and that behind every legend lies a human being, fragile, flawed, and yearning to be seen. And maybe that is the greatest tragedy of all, that Anthony Giri, the man, was never fully seen.